The wind carried the smell of rain and wood smoke across the valley that night, spring through the cracks of the old barn like a restless spirit. The man moved quietly, his boots brushing against dry hay as he checked on the horses one last time before turning in. Life on the frontier had hardened him, taught him silence, patience, the kind of awareness only a man who had lived too close to danger could understand. Yet nothing in all his years of war loss, loneliness, had prepared him for what he found lying in the shadows of his own shed. At first he thought it was an animal. The weak rustle of hay, the faint sound of breath that came and went like a dying flame. But when the lantern light reached the far corner, the sight froze him in place. There, half covered in straw, pale and trembling, lay a woman. Her dress was torn, her skin bruised and smeared with dirt, her lips cracked as if she hadn't tasted water in days. For a moment, he didn't breathe. She looked too still, too fragile, as though life itself was slipping away from her. Then she stirred, her eyes fluttering open, catching the faint glow of the lantern. Fear filled them first, then confusion. He knelt beside her, his large hand hovering uncertainly above her shoulder. "Easy," he murmured, his voice low, carrying that calm steadiness of a man used to danger. "You're safe here." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure it was true. Safe wasn't something anyone could promise in this land, not when the soil still held the memory of blood, not when men carried grudges that lasted generations. The flickering lantern cast his shadow across the walls, revealing the deep lines of exhaustion on his face and the faded scars across his arms. He'd spent years fighting men from her kind, and she from his. Yet now, here she was, his enemy's wife. Or what remained of her. Her voice came as a whisper. "Don't. Send me back." The words hit him harder than he expected. He didn't answer right away, only reached for the water flask hanging by the post. When he held it to her lips, she drank greedily, coughing between sips, tears spilling down her cheeks. She wasn't crying from gratitude. It was the kind of crying born from too much pain, too much hunger, and too many nights alone with the sound of one's own heartbeat as company. He looked at her closely then, and recognition struck him like a bullet. He'd seen her before months ago, standing beside her husband when a trade agreement turned into bloodshed. That husband had led a raid against his people, burning their shelters and leaving graves in their wake. He'd watched the man ride off victorious, never imagining that his proud young wife would one day collapse starving in the shed of the very man her husband had tried to destroy. "Why are you here?" he asked quietly, more to himself than to her, but she only closed her eyes, her breath shallow. The answer was written all over her body, the bruises, the torn dress, the way she flinched even in her sleep. Whoever had once claimed her had abandoned her, and the world had done the rest. He rose slowly, pacing the small space, torn between what he knew and what he felt. Logic told him to leave her there. She wasn't his responsibility. Worse, if anyone found her here, it would bring more trouble than he could handle. The war between their people had left scars that time hadn't healed. Harboring his enemy's woman would be seen as betrayal. But as the rain began to fall outside, tapping against the roof like a drumbeat, he looked back at her fragile form on the hay and knew he couldn't walk away. He fetched an old blanket, wrapping it gently around her. Her body was ice cold, her pulse faint. Every movement he made carried the weight of risk. If word got out, he'd lose his land, his freedom, maybe even his life. But something deeper than fear guided him that night, a quiet voice inside that said saving her might save a part of himself he thought long dead. The storm grew heavier. Wind howled through the cracks, and thunder rolled across the plains. He fed the horses again, partly to calm them, and partly to buy time to think. The world outside was turning mean, full of men who believed mercy was weakness. Yet here he was, standing between what was right and what was safe. When he returned to her side, she was shivering violently. He built a small fire in the corner of the shed, careful not to let the smoke give him away. The light fell softly across her face, revealing the faint beauty still hidden beneath dirt and exhaustion. She looked young to have suffered so much. He wondered what kind of life she'd lived before fate brought her here, broken and desperate. As he watched her, his thoughts wandered back to the battles that had shaped him. He'd lost brothers, friends, and a home to men like her husband. The hate between their people had been passed down like an inheritance. But looking at her now, he couldn't summon that hate. He only saw a soul too tired to fight anymore. By dawn, the rain stopped. Mist drifted over the valley, wrapping the land in a soft, cold silence. He hadn't slept at all. When she finally stirred, her eyes met his, and for a moment neither spoke. There was an understanding between them, fragile and dangerous. "You shouldn't have helped me," she whispered. "If they find out, they'll come for you." He gave a small, humorless smile. "They'll have to find you first." She tried to sit up, but pain made her collapse again. He caught her before she hit the floor. For a brief second, she was in his arms, trembling, her heartbeat faint against his chest. That single moment changed everything. He realized he couldn't turn her away now, not after this. Outside, a crow called from the fence post, breaking the silence. It was a warning. He knew men would come searching sooner or later. Maybe her husband's people. Maybe his. Either way, he had little time before someone noticed her tracks leading to his barn. He stood, gripping his coat, and glanced toward the hills beyond his ranch. The trails there were hidden, used only by hunters and outlaws. He could take her there, keep her safe until she was strong enough to move on. But that meant vanishing from everything he'd built, risking his name, his home, and his peace. When he looked back, she was watching him, her eyes soft but uncertain. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. The truth was something he barely understood himself. Maybe it was guilt, maybe loneliness, or maybe in saving her. He was trying to rewrite the cruel story of the land they both belonged to. Finally, he said, "Because no one deserves to die in a place meant for horses." Her gaze lingered on him, as if searching for the man beneath the scars. Then she whispered, "They'll come." "You know they will," he nodded slowly. "Then I'll be ready." The morning light slipped through the gaps in the wooden walls. Falling across the two of them, the wounded woman and the man sworn to hate her kind. Outside, the world was waking up, unaware that in a quiet, forgotten shed, an old war had just been challenged by a simple act of mercy. But mercy has a price. And as distant hoofbeats echoed faintly in the valley, he realized that the cost of saving her life might soon demand his own. The sun climbed slowly over the distant ridges, painting the plains in pale gold and smoke-blue shadows. The man stood by the doorway of the shed, one hand resting on the wooden frame as he watched the world wake. The night had been long, filled with doubts that refused to leave his mind. He had spent years surviving by following rules of silence and caution. But now one starving woman had turned his whole life on its head. Inside the shed, she was still asleep, breathing lightly under the old blanket he had wrapped around her. She looked peaceful, but he knew that peace would not last once the world outside learned she was there. He turned away from the sunrise, walked to the small stream that cut through his land. The cold water stung his face as he splashed it, trying to clear his thoughts. The valley was quiet except for the call of distant birds and the soft rustle of wind through the grass. It was hard to believe that not too long ago, this same land had echoed with the sounds of gunfire and screams. He had seen men fall here, friends and enemies alike, all for causes that seemed so far away now. What remained were scars, both on the land and in the hearts of those who survived. When he came back to the shed, she was awake, sitting weakly against the wall. The morning light touched her face, and he noticed the bruises along her neck more clearly now. They weren't the marks of hunger or travel. They were the kind left by cruelty. She looked away when she realized he was watching her, her voice trembling as she said, "I didn't mean to come here. I just didn't have anywhere else to go." Crouched beside the fire, adding a few small sticks to keep it alive. "You walked a long way," he said quietly. "You're lucky you made it this far." She gave a bitter smile. Lucky isn't the word I'd use. There was a long silence. He wanted to ask her what happened, how she ended up half dead in his shed, but he sensed that the answer would not come easily. Pain like hers didn't come from one moment. It came from a chain of them, each one heavier than the last. Finally, she spoke again, her voice low. "He cast me out. Said I brought shame. After the last raid, his men turned on him. They blamed me for it. Said I was the reason he lost half his horses. He left me behind to prove a point. Her hands trembled as she pulled the blanket tighter around herself. I walked for days. Thought maybe someone would take pity, but they all shut their doors. The man listened in silence, his jaw tightening. He remembered the raid she spoke of, the one that had left several of his kin dead. He remembered the name of her husband, too. The thought that the same man who caused so much suffering had left his own wife to die in the cold brought a hard knot to his chest. Yet hearing her speak, he couldn't find hate in himself. Only a strange sadness that reached deeper than reason. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally, though his tone was more of warning than rejection. "If anyone finds out, they'll call it treason." She looked up at him with weary eyes. "Then why didn't you turn me out?" He didn't answer. The truth was something he didn't want to face. Maybe he was tired of doing what others expected. Maybe he simply couldn't stand seeing another person suffer in silence. Whatever the reason, it had already taken root. He brought her a bowl of broth from the cabin, thickened with what little food he had left. She ate slowly, careful not to take more than she needed. "I'll work for it," she said softly. "If you let me stay, I'll work. I'm not useless." He shook his head. "You need strength first. Then we'll talk about work." Outside, the day grew warmer, but he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that came with every creak of the shed walls. The sound of distant hoofbeats made him glance toward the road more than once. He had kept to himself for years, living quiet, staying invisible. But now, one act of kindness could destroy all of that. Later that day, while she rested, he went to the edge of his land where the old fence had fallen. The ground there still showed the faint remains of wagon tracks, recent ones. Someone had passed close. Maybe travelers, maybe scouts. He knelt, touching the dirt, and saw the print of horseshoes sharper than he liked. It meant, whoever they were, they had stopped nearby. He stood for a long moment, the breeze tugging at his hair, before heading back toward the cabin. Inside the shed, the woman was awake again, her eyes alert now instead of dazed. "You're expecting someone," she said quietly, noticing the way he scanned the horizon every few minutes. "No," he replied, "but someone might be expecting me." He didn't tell her that men from both sides often passed through this, valley traders, scouts, sometimes bounty hunters. Word traveled fast across the frontier, and secrets rarely stayed buried for long. He could already imagine how the story would spread if they found her here, that the man who once fought for battles now hid the wife of his greatest enemy. It would bring questions, suspicion, and revenge. By late afternoon, she was able to stand with his help. Her legs shook, but she refused to stay still. "If I stay hidden, they'll never stop looking," she said. "You'll lose everything." He looked at her steadily. "If I send you out there now, you won't last the night. You're not strong enough." Her gaze hardened, though tears shimmered in her eyes. "Then why do you care?" He opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. Instead, he handed her a piece of bread and turned away, his heart caught between anger and something he didn't want to name. Caring was dangerous. It was the one thing he had promised himself he would never do again. As the evening shadows grew long, he returned to his cabin and began to prepare supplies, quietly extra blankets, a canteen, dried meat. He didn't know how long he could keep her there, but he knew he couldn't leave her defenseless. While he worked, her voice came from behind him, faint but clear. "They'll come for me. You know that, don't you?" "I know," he said, without looking back. "And when they do?" He paused, his hands still on the rope he was tying. "Then we'll see what kind of man I really am." Her eyes softened for a moment, but she said nothing more. The night returned with the same quiet it had the evening before. He made a small fire again, its light casting a glow across the barn walls. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, their cries echoing through the valley. She lay down again on the hay, and for the first time her body seemed to relax. Maybe it was the food, or maybe it was the faint feeling of safety. He watched her for a while before stepping outside, leaning against the post, his thoughts heavy. The stars stretched endlessly above him, cold and bright. Somewhere out there were men hunting. One of them would surely be her husband. He remembered that man clearly, his arrogance, his cruelty, the way he'd looked down on everyone he deemed beneath him. The thought of that same man leaving his wife to starve filled him with a slow-burning anger. But beneath the anger was something even more dangerous, a growing need to protect her, no matter what it cost. When dawn came again, he found her awake, already trying to help by sweeping the shed floor with a broken branch. "You shouldn't be up," he said, but she only gave him a small, tired smile. "I've been useless long enough," she replied. That day passed quietly, though the tension never left him. Each sound in the distance made his hand drift to the rifle by the door. Every time a bird took flight, he wondered if it was warning of someone approaching. The silence between them was filled with unspoken things, gratitude, guilt, and the growing realization that their fates were now tangled together. By evening, clouds gathered again, thick and heavy with rain. He was cutting wood when he noticed movement far across the ridge, a small line of riders moving slow but steady. His breath caught, too far to be certain, but close enough to mean danger. He dropped the axe, eyes fixed on the horizon. Inside, unaware, she was folding the old blanket, humming faintly under her breath, trying to bring a trace of normal life into a world that had forgotten what peace felt like. He stood frozen, knowing that before another dawn, choices would have to be made. Choices that would test not only his courage, but the line between mercy and betrayal. The sound of thunder rolled once again across the valley, and as he looked toward the riders approaching from the distance, he knew the past he had tried to bury was already on its way to find him. The line of riders across the ridge moved like shadows against the fading light, and his heart tightened as he counted them. 4, maybe 5. They were too far to make out faces, but their formation told him enough. These were not travelers. They were searching for something or someone. He stepped back into the barn quietly, his boots barely making a sound on the old boards. The woman was still near the corner, folding what little she had used through the day. She looked up when she saw his face, reading the worry before he could speak. "They're coming," said simply. Her hands froze around the edge of the blanket. "Are you sure it's them?" He nodded once. "Riders don't come that way unless they're looking for trouble. You need to stay quiet no matter what happens." She swallowed hard, glancing toward the door as if she could already hear the approaching hooves. "If it's his men, they'll burn everything," she whispered. "They'll kill you for helping me." He turned to his rifle leaning against the wall and checked the chamber, his movements calm and practiced. "They'll have to try first." The air inside the barn grew heavy. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering dust across the yard. He thought fast. If the riders were scouts, they'd come close but not linger. But if they were her husband's men, they'd search every inch of this place until they found her. He had two choices: hide her and face them alone, or run and risk being hunted. Neither option offered much hope. He dragged a few hay bales toward the back wall, revealing a hollow space behind them where the old boards had loosened over the years. "Get in there," he said. "It'll keep you out of sight if they come." She hesitated. "And what about you?" He met her eyes briefly. "I've been through worse." Her fingers trembled as she crawled into the small gap, pulling the hay back around her until she disappeared from view. He adjusted a few loose strands to cover any sign of movement, then took a slow breath and stepped outside. The riders were closer now, their horses kicking up dust. As they approached the fence line, he could see their faces, more clearly rough men with hardened eyes carrying rifles slung across their shoulders. The one in front wore a black coat, long and weathered, his expression cold. He reined his horse in near the gate, staring at the man standing by the barn. "Evening," the rider called. "Didn't mean to spook you. We're just passing through." "Evening," he replied, his voice steady. "Not many come this way." "You lost?" The man in black smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Looking for someone." "A woman? Small? Dark hair?" "She ran off from a nearby ranch a few days ago. Maybe you've seen her." He shook his head slowly. "Haven't seen anyone in weeks. This valley's quiet now." The rider tilted his head, studying him. "You live alone here?" "Always have." Silence stretched. Behind him, he could almost hear her breathing through the wall. The smallest sound would ruin everything. The rider's eyes swept across the barn, the fences, the cabin beyond. Mind if we take a look around? His fingers tightened slightly around the rifle in his hand. Depends who's asking. The man's smile faded. Just concerned citizens, friend. That woman's in danger. Her husband's offering a reward for her safe return. Safe. He repeated the word with quiet disbelief. Doesn't sound like she left safety behind. The rider's expression hardened. You sure you haven't seen her? He met his gaze without blinking. If I had, I'd tell you. The standoff lasted another breath before the rider finally pulled on his reins. If she comes through here, you let us know, he said. Some folks might think twice before crossing the wrong man. I'll remember that, he replied, watching them turn and ride back the way they came. He stayed still until the sound of hooves faded completely, only then letting out the breath he'd been holding. When he returned inside, she was already crawling out from behind the hay, her face pale. It was them, wasn't it? She whispered. He nodded. They'll be back. They're heading toward the ridge, but once they don't find tracks, they'll circle again. Her eyes filled with fear. We can't stay here. He knew she was right, but the thought of moving her in her condition gnawed at him. If we leave now, we'll be exposed. The rain's coming again. They'll track our prints. She stepped closer, her voice shaking. You don't understand. He won't stop until I'm found. I saw what he did to the last one who ran. She caught herself and looked away, her breath unsteady. If he finds me alive, it'll be worse. He studied her for a moment. The storm outside mirrored the one brewing between them, fear and determination pulling in opposite directions. Finally, he said, then we'll leave before dawn. There's an old trail that cuts through the canyon. Hard to follow, even for skilled trackers. She nodded, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. You're risking everything for me. Why? He hesitated. Because I know what it's like to lose everything. That night, neither of them slept much. The wind howled, and the barn creaked as if the land itself was warning them. He checked his rifle again and packed what food they had left. Every sound made his heart beat faster. He had lived through raids and ambushes, but this felt different. This was personal. When the first light touched the hills, they were already on horseback, riding into the mist that hung low across the valley. She rode behind him, gripping the saddle tight, her head bowed against the cold. The path was narrow, weaving between rocks and thorny brush. He knew these trails well. They had once been escape routes during the war. As they rode, the silence between them grew heavy. She finally spoke, her voice almost lost in the wind. Do you think he'll ever stop hunting me? No, he said. Men like him don't stop until someone makes them. She didn't reply, but he could feel her trembling. They traveled for hours, resting only once near a dried creek bed. She drank from the canteen, her eyes distant. He wasn't always like that, she said softly. When we first met, he was kind, brave. Everyone admired him. But power changes people. After the raids, after the killings, something in him turned dark. I think he began to see everyone, including me, as something to own. He watched her closely, the pain in her voice cutting deeper than she knew. He had seen men like that before, men who believed the land and people were theirs to claim. And when you tried to leave? He asked. He beat me, she said quietly. Said no one would take what was his. Then he left me in the desert as punishment. The words sank into him like cold steel. He looked away toward the horizon, where dark clouds were forming again. He'll come here himself next time, he said. He won't trust his men to finish it. They rode on until night began to fall, stopping near an old trapper's cabin long abandoned. Inside, dust covered everything, but it offered shelter. She lit a small lantern while he checked the surroundings. The stillness felt uneasy, as if the world was holding its breath. Why do you live alone? She asked after a while. He leaned against the doorframe, looking out at the rain beginning to fall again. Because it's quieter that way. I lost too much when I trusted people. My family, my tribe, my land. War took it all. She lowered her gaze. Then why save me? He sighed. Maybe because no one saved them. For a long time there was silence between them, filled only by the steady rhythm of rain on the roof. Yet even in that silence, something was shifting, something fragile, dangerous, and real, but far away in the valley. The sound of thunder wasn't just the storm. The riders had returned, following the faintest of clues, a broken twig, a horse print near the stream, a trail left by fate itself. And leading them this time was the man in the black coat, his face darker than before, his voice cold as the rain. "Find her," he ordered, "and burn everything he owns to the ground, if you have to." Back at the cabin, the man and the woman sat by the fire, unaware of how close the danger had already come. Outside, the storm roared louder, and lightning flashed across the mountains. The air was thick with the scent of rain and smoke, and though they didn't know it yet, their fight for survival had only just begun. The storm rolled across the mountains through the night, wild and restless, as if nature itself was warning them to turn back. Inside the cabin, the man kept the fire low, listening to every sound beyond the walls. The horses were tied under the trees, restless from the wind. The woman sat near the fire, her hands clasped tightly around a tin cup, eyes fixed on the door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. Neither spoke much through the night. Words felt too small against the fear that pressed on them. Every gust of wind sounded like a voice, every creak in the cabin like footsteps in the mud. He knew they had been found, maybe not yet, but soon. Her husband's men were too skilled to give up a trail that easily died by dawn. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was worse. Mist clung low to the valley, muffling every sound. He stepped outside and scanned the ridges. No movement yet, but he could feel eyes on them. He had lived long enough on the frontier to know when he was being hunted. Inside, she was trying to help pack their few supplies, though her hands shook as she worked. He could see the exhaustion in her movements, but she refused to rest. "If we keep moving, maybe we can reach the river by night," she said softly. "They won't cross the current. They'll think we drowned." He looked at her, admiring the strength in her voice despite the fear behind it. "We'll make it," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. They set off before sunrise, riding hard through narrow trails and rocky slopes. The air was cold and sharp, carrying the smell of wet pine and smoke from some faraway fire. Every now and then, he glanced behind them. The path was clean for now, but tracks didn't stay hidden forever. Around midday, they stopped by a cliff overlooking a narrow canyon. From there, he could see miles of open land below, the kind of place where anyone traveling would be easily spotted. "We'll need to stay to the shadows," he said. "They'll ride through the open plains. We'll keep high and move slow." She nodded, gripping the reins tighter. "You've done this before?" "Too many times," he replied quietly. They began the long descent through the canyon, guiding their horses through mud and fallen rocks. The air grew thick and still, the kind of silence that made even breathing sound loud. Halfway down, the woman's horse stumbled, letting out a frightened cry. The sound echoed across the valley like a warning bell. He turned instantly, eyes scanning the ridges. "We have to move faster," he said. "They'll have heard that." They pushed forward until the canyon opened into a small stretch of forest. There, they stopped to catch their breath. He built a small fire to warm the horses, then turned to her. "If they catch up to us, we'll split," he said. "They'll go after me first. You follow the river north." Her eyes widened. "I'm not leaving you." He held her gaze, his voice firm. "You will, if you want to live." Before she could argue, the faint sound of hooves reached them through the trees. It was distant, but steady. He put out the fire with his boot and motioned for silence. The forest grew tense, the only sound the slow drip of water from the leaves. Minutes later, the riders appeared through the mist, 3 of them this time, spread out and cautious. He recognized the man in black at once, sitting tall in the saddle, scanning the ground like a wolf catching scent. Her husband. The woman froze when she saw him, her hand flying to her mouth. The man gently pulled her behind a fallen log, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Stay here. Don't move." He crawled quietly through the brush, rifle in hand, positioning himself between the riders and the cabin they had just left behind. His breath was steady, his mind clear. He'd fought before. He knew how to wait. The men dismounted, spreading out, checking the tracks. "They came through here," the husband said. His voice was calm to calm. "The tracks are fresh." One of his men kicked at the ashes of the small fire. They stopped to rest. "We're close." The husband's eyes narrowed. "Then keep looking. She can't hide forever. The man with her he'll die for this." The sound of his voice twisted something inside the man hidden in the brush. He had faced killers before, but there was something different about this one, coldness wrapped in pride. A man who believed everything he touched belonged to him. When the riders moved farther up the path, he signaled the woman to mount. They rode in the opposite direction, through a ravine so narrow the branches tore at their clothes. Mud splashed against them, and the horses slipped on wet stone, but they didn't stop. The sound of pursuit returned, faint at first, then louder. By evening, rain began again, turning the path to slick clay. They reached the edge of the river, a roaring current swollen by the storm. She looked at the rushing water, panic flashing in her eyes. "We can't cross that. It'll kill us. It's the only way," he said. "They'll track us if we stay on this side." She hesitated, her voice breaking. "If we don't make it," he cut her off gently. "Then we try again." Lightning split the sky as they urged the horses forward into the freezing water. The current pulled hard, almost tearing the reins from his hands. She clung to him, her face buried against his back, her breath sharp with fear. For a moment, it felt like the river would win. But somehow, through strength and sheer will, they reached the far bank. Drenched and shaking, they stumbled onto the muddy shore, gasping for air. Behind them, the sound of shouting echoed faintly. "The riders had reached the river too. They'll think we drowned," he said between breaths. "That'll buy us time." She sank to her knees, tears mixing with the rain. "I don't want to run anymore," she whispered. "I just want to be free." He crouched beside her, his voice low and steady. "You will be, I promise." But deep down, he knew promises meant little on land like this. Freedom always came at a price. They found shelter that night in an old cave hidden behind a curtain of vines. The fire crackled softly, throwing shadows against the stone walls. She lay wrapped in a blanket, her body trembling from cold and exhaustion. He sat nearby, staring into the flames, his thoughts dark and restless. She spoke after a while, her voice fragile. "You could still leave me? Go back to your life. They'd never find you." He looked at her, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "That life ended when I found you in my shed." The words hung between them, heavy and honest. She turned her face away, tears glistening in the flickering light. Outside, the rain slowed, but the sound of distant thunder lingered. Somewhere out there, her husband was still hunting, relentless as ever. The man knew it was only a matter of time before he caught up. But something inside him had changed. He was no longer just running to save her life. He was fighting to protect something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose, redemption. Before dawn, he left the cave quietly, climbing to the ridge to scout the valley below. What he saw made his heart drop. Smoke rose in the distance. The cabin was burning. Her husband's men had found it and destroyed everything. There would be no going back now. He returned to the cave, his expression grave. "They've found the cabin," he said. "They'll know we crossed the river." She met his gaze, fear flickering in her eyes. But there was something else there to resolve. "Then we stop running," she said softly. "We make our stand." He nodded slowly. "If that's what it takes." The fire crackled between them as dawn painted the world in shades of red and gold. Outside, the forest waited in silence. The hunt was nearly over, but the real fight was just beginning. Both of them knew that when the sun rose higher, their fates would meet the edge of whatever destiny had been waiting all along. The first light of dawn spilled softly through the trees, washing the valley in a calm that felt almost unreal. The night before had been endless, filled with tension and the sound of distant thunder that seemed to echo their fears. Now the storm had passed, but its silence carried the weight of everything they knew was coming. He stood at the mouth of the cave, watching the horizon with careful eyes. The smell of smoke still lingered faintly in the air from the burned cabin across the river. That life, everything he'd once built, was gone. But standing behind him was a reason to keep going. She stepped out from the shadows. Wrapped in the blanket he had given her, her face pale but calm. The look in her eyes was different, no longer just fear, but quiet strength. "They'll come," she said softly. He nodded. "I know." "Then let's finish it," she whispered. He turned to face her fully. "Once we do, there's no going back. If we win, we start over. If we lose—" She stepped closer, interrupting him gently. "If we lose, at least we won't run anymore." The words hit him deep. He saw in her the same fire he'd lost long ago, the will to stand even when everything was against you. For a moment, he almost smiled. "Then we make our stand," he said. They spent the morning preparing. He checked his rifle and the small stash of ammunition he had carried through the wilderness. She helped gather dry branches for cover, her movements careful but steady. The forest around them was alive with quiet anticipation, as if the world itself was holding its breath for what was about to happen. By midday, the first signs appeared. The faint echo of hooves reached them from the ridge above. She froze, her fingers tightening around the edge of her blanket. He motioned for silence, crouching low. Through the thick brush, he saw 3 riders enter the valley, scanning both sides of the river. Then came a fourth, the man in the black coat, her husband. Even from this distance, his presence was unmistakable. They watched as the riders dismounted, leading their horses along the riverbank. "They'll follow the tracks," the man whispered. "We'll use the ridge. It's narrow, and it'll force them one by one." She looked at him, her eyes filled with worry. "You're not thinking of fighting them alone, are you?" "I'm thinking of ending this," he replied quietly. "For both of us." He led her to a spot behind a cluster of rocks, near the ridge's edge. From there, she could see everything the riders below. The trees swaying and the wide sky that seemed to stretch forever. He placed his rifle down, adjusting its aim. "If something happens to me, follow the river north," he said. Her voice trembled. "Stop talking like that." He looked at her for a long moment, and something softened in his eyes. "You gave me a reason to fight again. That's not something I forget." Before she could reply, a sharp crack echoed through the volley a rifle shot. The bullet struck the ground near them, sending dust flying. The riders had seen movement. "They've spotted us," he shouted. He returned fire, his shot precise, echoing off the rock walls. One of the riders fell, his horse bolting into the trees. The others took cover, firing back. She covered her ears as bullets struck the rocks around them, splintering pieces of bark and stone. The man reloaded quickly, keeping his focus. His heartbeat was steady, his movements deliberate. Years of surviving on the frontier had taught him that fear only made you die faster. Below, her husband barked orders, his voice rising in fury. "Flush them out. Bring her to me alive." The woman's eyes filled with tears, but not from fear. She was angry now. Angry at the man who had hunted her, who believed she would always belong to him. She picked up the spare revolver from his pack and looked at him. "I won't hide anymore." He didn't have time to argue. More riders were climbing the ridge, moving fast. He fired again, hitting one of the attackers before ducking behind cover. The air was thick with gunpowder and the smell of wet earth. When the next man reached the top, she fired her revolver with shaking hands. The sound was deafening, but her shot found its mark. The man looked at her in surprise and pride. "Good," he said, reloading his rifle. "You're stronger than you think." The last to come was the husband. He climbed slowly, his dark coat flapping in the wind, his face twisted with rage. When he reached the ridge, he called out, "You think you can hide her from me? She's mine." The woman stepped out from behind the rocks before the man could stop her. "Not anymore," she said firmly. Her voice was calm, steady, but filled with years of pain finally finding release. The husband raised his weapon, but before he could fire, the man moved between them. The shot rang out, echoing across the valley. For a second, everything was still. Then her husband dropped his rifle, his shoulder bleeding. The man stepped closer, aiming again but hesitating. He didn't want to kill, not unless he had to. "Walk away," he said coldly. "This ends here." But pride was stronger than reason. Her husband lunged forward, trying to grab the rifle. They struggled briefly, the sound of boots scraping on rock, the grunt of effort. The woman watched helplessly, tears running down her face. Then, with one final push, the man sent his enemy sprawling backward, tumbling down the ridge into the brush below. Silence followed. Only the wind remained. The man stood, breathing hard, lowering his rifle. She ran to him, clutching his arm. "Is it over?" she whispered. He looked down the ridge. "It's over." They stayed there for a long time, neither speaking, just listening to the quiet return to the valley. The birds began to sing again, and the smell of rain faded into the scent of pine. For the first time in what felt like forever, peace returned. Days passed as they made their way north, leaving the river and burned cabin behind. They found a small settlement hidden between two hills where no one asked questions and no one cared about the past. The people there traded warmth for work, and he found his strength again in building fences and tending horses. She helped in the small garden behind their cabin, her laughter slowly replacing the silence that had once surrounded her. One evening, as the sun set over the hills, she stood outside watching the sky turn gold. He came beside her, his rough hands now steady, his face gentler than before. "You ever think about going back?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "There's nothing left to go back to, only forward." He nodded. "Then forward it is." They stood there for a long time, side by side, the world finally quiet. The pain, the loss, the fear, all of it had brought them here, to a place where they could start over. The past had chased them, nearly destroyed them. But it had also led them to something neither had expected, a chance at peace. As the stars began to appear above the hills, she leaned against him, her voice soft. "When you found me, I thought it was the end, but it was the beginning." He smiled faintly. Sometimes the worst storms bring the best mornings. In that quiet valley, under the open sky, the echoes of their struggle faded into memory. The land that had once witnessed pain now held the promise of healing. And though their scars would never completely fade, they carried them with pride, not as reminders of what they'd lost, but of what they'd survived. Their story became part of the valley's whisper, told by wind and remembered by the earth, the tale of a man who risked everything to save his enemy's rejected wife, and the woman who taught him that even in the harshest wilderness, there was still room for love, forgiveness, and a second chance at life. And as the night deepened, with the fire crackling softly and the sound of crickets rising in the distance, they finally found what both had been searching for all along, not just freedom, but home.